best.
Okay.
All right, Zach, I appreciate you meeting with me here. And so I just have some questions I'm going to run through with you for our pre-conference here before our observation that we'll do later this week, right?
Yep.
So let's kind of just start off with you maybe describing briefly for me the students in your class.
Okay, so we have, we've taken our fourth grade and we've split it so that it is going to be a high ability group and a low ability group. So that's something that's already been done. So there'll be a switch right before you walk in so that those low kids will stay in my room.
Okay.
The high kids will go over to Amy and do language arts and whatever. So within that, then I'll have both of our IEPs, our math IEPs in that classroom, and also with that will be 2 behavior IEPs, and those 2 will be grouped or sitting with a para at that time. So those are based off of their ability levels that we did with a beginning of the year assessment, so the pre-assessment that went along with our curriculum, and then obviously a BV assessment that we've done, our Boulder Valley assessment that kind of decides what are they missing. So we'll group according to that on Fridays, but when you're there, just on Wednesday, we'll just group based off that pre-assessment from the beginning of the year.
All right. And so any of those students, maybe your behavior students or math IEP students, do they have any special needs you're going to have to address during this class time, or are there any special areas that you kind of have set up in your room? You mentioned a para.
Yep. And the para will be there the entire time, so she's more there for the behavior students, so she'll just make sure that they're staying on task and kind of give them nods and things to get them back on task. With the IEP student, they'll leave the room for an amount of minutes to go see their special ed teacher. But then the special ed teacher will also come down. We've got it set up so the special ed teacher will come down and teach us a lesson with the small group of kids that we've decided need extra help. So that includes not only our 2 IEP students, but it also includes a couple other kids that we've decided need help with adding and subtracting strategies. So she comes down and does a 10 to 15-minute strategy intervention with those kids.
So is that Ms. Ford?
During our small group, yes, Ms. Ford.
So will she be in there?
She will be in there for a stretch of 10 to 15 minutes with a small group while I'm doing small groups as well.
Okay, great. Great. So what Iowa teaching standards criteria will be demonstrated in this observation?
I think the competence of the content knowledge, so focusing that we are really going to stress that we've done a lot of the multiplication stuff, and we're going to continue that in this lesson. So showing you that I know that there's multiple strategies that go along with teaching the multiplication, that we're going to be using those multiple strategies, and that the kids know how to use those multiple strategies. Along with that, teaching standard number 4, the strategies that meet multiple learning needs. So you're going to see that we're going to be in small groups that are going to be focused on different strategies, the ones that work for certain kids. You see that we've already got a small group, as I just mentioned with Ms. Ford, that are working on strategies that they need, that they don't have, that we're already trying to fill in those gaps. So they'll be working with it. So you're going to see that my classroom is pretty differentiated, even though we separated them out as small or into a high and low groups. So there's going to be a lot of differentiation or strategies that are going to meet for those multiple learning needs. And then the last one is the teacher standard number 5, multiple methods to monitor student learning. You're going to see that I'm going to a lot of before they leave the classroom, I'll have something that I want them to hand to me so that I can look over and see that they understood or did not understand today's lesson, or the big idea of the lesson. That I'll also be monitoring things at the small group, so I have a focus on 2 questions that I'll make sure that I look at the small group to make sure that I understand where kids are at, and just the monitoring as I walk around the classroom and I have a mental idea and I'll be jotting notes. So a lot of formative assessment within the small group, within the whole group, and as they walk out of the room. So
awesome. So there's gonna be a lot going on there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that I'm interested how you said multiple learning needs. I mean, even though you guys split that class, you're still gonna have kids within that class that have differentiated needs for sure.
Yeah, we've really identified that. I mean, the kids have certain gaps that they're missing. So we have to focus on multiplication as our standards say, and we're going to work multiplication with those kids, but we've also identified them as having even bigger needs as far as, so we go back, and I think that's important for those guys to go back and get those addition and subtraction strategies, so we have a session for them, but they'll also come back to the back table and they'll work those multiplication things that we just did in the whole group. So it's just identifying that we have kids that need help, and so we want to make sure we're giving them the help.
Sure, for sure. So what are some things for this lesson, we'll talk a little bit specifically here, but what are some things about your students' readiness this whole group, as we think about them and all their differentiated needs, about their student readiness, they're influencing your lesson design as you prepared for this lesson?
Yeah, so we have taken many different assessments to show that they are ready, or they've shown mastery of a certain multiplication, 1 digit by 3 digit, 1 digit by 2 digit, 1 digit by 4 digit. They've shown most, I won't say all, but most kids have shown that they're ready to move on. So we've done that assessment, we've done that reassessment, we've done the reteaching with all that. So we've really been focusing on multiplication now for a month, upwards of 5 weeks now after about this midweek. So we're now changing gears, and we're going to take it to 2 digit by 2 digit. And so that's just been introduced on Monday. So today's Tuesday. So tomorrow's will be our 3rd day really talking with 2 digit by 2 digit multiplication, which is going to be a stress for some kids as they've really just started to feel comfortable with that 1 digit multiplier. Now we're going to 2 digits. But a lot of those strategies, all those strategies that we've done previously will now carry over to that. And the building blocks that we've done with the 1 digit are the same way that we're going to build it up for the 2 digits. So we always start with making sure that they can multiply by powers of 10. We always start with being able to estimate and then to multiply, and then we start getting into our big strategies. So really tomorrow's lesson will be focused on building those estimation and being able to multiply with zeros, and then starting one of our area model strategies for multiplication.
So is that then your learning target, multiplying by zeros?
That'll be part of it, because I want to be able to make sure that my kids are ready to go to the area model. So I've taken whatever I've done today, and I've looked at that data and seen that there are some kids that have some misconceptions with the zeros, so that's going to be part of my lesson. So I'm kind of blending what I would say is like my 2nd lesson and my 3rd lesson and my multiplication by 2 digit lessons, and I want to be able to make sure that we clear up that misconception with the zeros, but it'll tie in perfectly with the area model as well.
Gotcha.
So it just kind of goes hand in hand that we'll be able to do that as a whole group, no problem.
Great. So what are some skills, knowledge that your skills or knowledge that your students will need to bring with them to be successful in tomorrow's lesson?
The big thing is that we're seeing that if we're missing problems, like the things that we've already done assessed on the multiplication, is that the basic fact is an issue. So we've really focused on some strategies to fix that, to try and get those basic facts as clean as possible. But that's still going to be an issue tomorrow as kids try and answer questions, and they'll mess up 4 times 3, and they might say that's 13 as opposed to 12, and you'll see that problem occurring, and that's why they're going to miss the problem. But we also need to make sure that they have that times 10 relationship. So knowing that when you're timesing by 10 or a multiple of 10, that you're really moving one place value over, so going from a 10 to 100, and we really, that's kind of another standard, but we always tie it in, especially when we do multiplication, that there is that relationship. So they should bring those components to tomorrow's lesson.
Great. And so your standard, you're familiar with what standard you're working on tomorrow?
For MBT 5 is our standard. So numbers of base 10, 4th grade, the 5th one, and that's a big one because it's our multiplication and our division one. So
this would be something that they'll apply later in their
absolutely.
learning.
So they'll start to realize that the multiplication and division go together, and how they connect. And so it's a big one that we spend a lot of our time on throughout the year.
All right, so as I'm sitting in your class tomorrow, how are you going to ensure engagement of all your students? What kinds of things am I going to see you doing to make sure your students are engaged with their learning, with you, when they're working in their groups, et cetera, et cetera?
A lot of it, I think, is based on the routines we've already set. So there's not going to be much change in what we normally do on a regular basis. But that'll stay the same. But a lot of where I would see maybe that non-engagement would be during our whole group time. And so I like to be able to ask students to have conversations with a partner. I like to group them so they have a conversation with somebody different, to make sure there's a little buy-in from each one. So that'll be the big one, that I'll have a conversation and say that you guys need to have a conversation about what we're doing. But there'll also be proximity, so I'm not going to try and stay in front of the room. I'll try and walk around and make sure that I'm by some of those kids that we know are the bigger issues as far as paying attention. So those are the 2 big ones. And then when we get into small groups, that's one where it's tough because I'll have a back table group, and so what are those other kids doing? And so truly With Miss Ford, she'll have her group, I'll have a group in there at the same time, but then there'll still that other group that is kind of on their own. And that's you know, you hope that the routine is set so that they know exactly what they're doing. There are times that I'm gonna have to look up and say something to, you know, to get them back on task, but I think the small group is something that we have to have, and I think it really helps with our differentiation within each group, so it's just one that you have to live with.
Great. So if you have any of your students drifting off or kind of not focused, let's talk during you mentioned a little bit during your whole group time, having to have conversations, but how are you going to re-engage those students? What kinds of techniques will you use to re-engage students?
The big one is I like to just call on them because it gets their attention and knows that I've seen that they're not engaged. Never to call them out and to make them feel horrible, but at least if I do call on them, if they hear their name, and then maybe I'll require them to ask me a question, because obviously if they're not engaged, if there's something that they are distracted, maybe it is that they just don't understand. So a lot of the time I just ask them to make sure that they ask me a question, and sometimes it helps not only them but other people in the class. So just asking them a class, but a lot of the time it can be fixed with just a simple movement of my body across the room.
Putting yourself in a different location.
Yeah.
Great. So talk to me about, as you're like thinking about this lesson tomorrow, what kind of difficulties your students might experience in this area that are going to interrupt a little bit tomorrow, or going to cause them to have some issues with the learning that's going on?
I think the basic facts we kind of already talked about will be an issue, and I don't really want to get out our multiplication chart because I sometimes feel that just becomes a crutch to them.
Sure.
And that's something that they just automatically go to. So we're really focusing on making sure kids have a direct idea of what multiplication is. So like putting them into groups, that's a strategy that if we don't know 4 times 4, then we can draw 4 circles, we can put 4 dots in, and we can do that. It's going to take some time, but at least they know that strategy. If they don't like that strategy, then they can put arrays in, and they know that strategy. So they can put dots in an array form, and they can be able to solve that problem. So they know there's multiple ways to solve those problems. They may still miss it, but I like to see them at least understanding what multiplication is. So kind of looking back to like third grade standards with that, but it requires them to at least show me what multiplication is, and then they still may miss it. But that's a basic fact thing that we feel is very important to start to kind of come around in 4th grade. But you're going to see them miss that. A bigger thing, I guess, when we start to think about the 4th grade stuff is that they'll forget their zeros. So that times 10 relationship. Some of them know the little tricks, so they start to see the patterns with zeros and knowing that if I have 2 zeros in my factors, that I'm going to have 2 zeros in my product, and they'll have those conversations. You'll hear those conversations. A little less probably with this group than the other group, but you'll hear them at least see that pattern start to happen. But then obviously they'll forget sometimes to bring that 0 down because they know that it should just go down. So some of those tricks that they'll maybe forget. But it'll be difficult. They haven't seen, some of them still use the area model on a regular basis with multiplication, but some other kids have started to choose partial products as their primary multiplicator strategy, and some of them started to choose regrouping or the algorithm as their strategy. So some of them haven't really seen area model for a while, or haven't used it consistently for a while. So it'll be a little bit of a test for them to kind of remember back to how we separate the area model out by place value, and then actually add in another component to that too. And the misconception that I often see with the area model is not knowing the lengths and the widths go together. So like this length, which this is this width, those are both 10s. So we're taking a 10 times a 10, and then I take my 10s times my 1s. Well, they don't realize that those two would go together. So it's kind of tying in that place value component again too. So you'll start to see they may have their numbers split up right. They may split up 23 as 20 and 3 right, but then not know that the 20 multiplied with the other
Sure,
absolutely will get wrong.
So you may have like answered this question. I mean, I know you actually did. So I'm gonna throw out just maybe what I heard you say. So some of these students that are struggling with these things, you've provided them some strategies. They know some strategies to kind of help them through. You know, you don't want them necessarily to use the crutch of their multiplication table where they can just find the answer really quick. Use strategies that we already have. So you've kind of provided them. Are there any other supports or options for support that you'll have for struggling students?
Well, I mean, the big thing is just understanding what each one of my groups needs. So when I say that there's multiple kids that I know that it would take it would take the whole class period to do one problem. So with some of those, with my IEP kids, especially my behavior kids, if I can keep them on task enough, and that requires them to use the multiplication chart, and they're going to get that done and know how to use that, then I'm going to let those two use that. So you might see a multiplication chart in those two's hands, because I think that's part of me keeping them on task. Sure. That if they don't know, or they think it takes way too long to do that, well, I'm not going to fight that fight with them as long as we can get the problem done. So those two kids will probably have their multiplication chart out so that they can at least get the things done, which will keep them engaged on what they're supposed to do, and helps them obviously so that when they don't struggle, then they don't start to build up their, they start to get a little fiery and then their behavior starts to act up. So that's one way that we try and eliminate those strugglers. Do we give them that and say that that's what you're going to use? Everybody else in the class, we've just separated out so that we know that you're in this group because of this reason, and so we'll work on that when we're in a small group.
The skills that they need there.
Yep.
Great. So I know you split the group, the classes, low and high, but within that, obviously, you have ranges as well. Yep. So talk about the students that we're going to see. Are there any kids that are going to need some enrichment, and how we provide that enrichment to challenge them? Because maybe they're struggling a little bit, but maybe they're farther along than others. So will we see any of that? Or
in the back table in those small group conversations, you'll see that those we'll still have those two questions that I for sure want to see, or those two problems that I want to see them complete. But I also will ask other questions, the higher order questions, or make them complete a problem in the Go Math enrichment part that will show me that they have a better understanding than just the basis of what we want. So those basically the questions that I ask at the back table will differentiate for those guys, or enrich those guys.
Oh, perfect. All right, so the instructional materials, you mentioned Go Math. Any other instructional materials that you'll be using during the day?
Tomorrow we're going to use graph paper and colored pencils so that we can separate out those partial products of each one of those in those area models, so kids can see that the tens and the tens are one color, the tens with the ones is another color, and so they'll start to see that as a visual learner, hopefully. So that's the big one for tomorrow. Is those two pieces, the graph paper and colored pencils.
Perfect. So how do you plan to assess your students' achievement of the goal for the day? So what kinds of things might we see tomorrow where you're doing some assessments, whether formal or informal, doesn't really matter?
Yeah, the big one will be those two questions that I talked about at the back table. So those two will stay consistent for every single group that comes and sees me. It'll again give me data for where each one of those kids is at. Do I need to regroup them based on those two questions? Those will give me a good idea of exactly where the misconceptions are, so that I can group them on, do they not understand the tense, where are they messing up? And so it gives me a lot of things for me to think about as far as where do I want to group them for the next day, but it also gives me a great idea of where those kids are at, and I'll have my booklet back there and I'll be taking notes and making sure I know exactly what each kid is struggling with, or what they're not, or what their successes are. So I'll have that right there for me to decide.
So let's think about it on a really finer level. Yep. Maybe. So okay, right or wrong with those questions, and I heard what you were saying there, so let's talk just a little deeper. So regardless of those questions, things you're going to see students doing or hear students saying that you're knowing they're making progress towards the goal. They may not be proficient at the goal yet, they may not be there, but things that you're going to hear, that I might hear to know that your students are working, and achieving, getting closer to where you want them.
Yeah. The big thing is that they can use some math language. So, partial products. If you can hear them say that those are, well, this is the answer to this, and if you can hear lengths and widths, if you can hear, well, I know that I need to do this with my zeros, or I know that, just hearing them have a conversation about the multiplication part of it, you're going to be able to see that our kids do have an understanding of multiplication, which is a great start, and then be able to see that they have strategies, or they might say, well, this is kind of like partial products, or this is, oh yeah, I remember doing area model for 3-digit by 1-digit, and now how is that different? So you'll hear me having those conversations with them too, trying to guide them and saying, you remember doing this, and just hopefully that it starts to click that when you have zeros, what do I do with zeros, or what is that rule telling me, or what was that pattern showing me? So you'll start to see, I think that you'll see that the kids are pretty good with their multiplying with numbers of 10, so 10, 20, 30, 40, you know, with a zero, and knowing what to do with those things. So.
Okay. So any other thing that you might want to bring to my attention about the class that we're going to observe? Anything in there that, I mean, you mentioned a lot of things, so, and I tried to get as many notes down as I could, but is anything specific or that we missed that you may see tomorrow?
The big thing is just so that you're aware of that small group that's going to be with Ms. Ford and what they're doing, because it's going to be a little bit off of what our standards or what our I can statement will say on the board.
Okay.
So knowing why they're doing what they're doing is something that we've just found, and we feel is important that every single day that they get a little bit of a supplement in that area. Again, that is with 2 of the IEP students, and then 2 others that could potentially have a goal for that. So we wanted to make sure that they're getting something that they're getting better at, and something that they've already previously missed. So that group will be doing something completely different with Ms. Ford for that 10 to 15 minutes while they're in that small group. But then again, they'll come right back to me and we'll get them back on to doing that multiplication stuff, the I can statement for us that's on the board. So they'll be getting that as well.
Is there anything, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit with this question, is there anything that specifically you want me to look for so that I could give you some feedback? Is there anything, whether it's management, whether it's, you know, conversations kids are having, something I can chart, or maybe I'm just listening for it, looking for it? Is there anything in particular that you would want some feedback about?
Yeah, I would be kind of interested in seeing or hearing if you had a conversation with the student on what kind of words you're hearing them say when they multiply. So I would be interested in seeing what the exact language, if there's any consistency to that language as you talk from person to person.
Okay.
So is it them saying that I know that I'm just supposed to bring the zeros down and then multiply the basic fact? Is that what they're saying? Or is it saying, or can you start to see in each one of your kids you speak to that they have a different strategy? Do they, like, could you be able to pick out the kid that's using regrouping?
Yep.
Could you pick out the kid that uses partial products, or could you pick out the kid that does the area model for each one of our multiplication things? And then I guess if you were listening to me at the back table, I would kind of wonder what you thought of my questioning,
okay,
and what level maybe you think that question is, and seeing if I really do differentiate those questions for each one of my 3 groups.
Okay, all right. So talk to me just so that logistic wise, so when will I have, that I'm not interrupting you, opportunities to visit with kids? Is it more during their small group time?
I think the small group will be the best time to do that.
All
so a lot of my time is really set up as we do the first 7 to 10 minutes on extra math. So they'll come in, the routine is they sit down and they do their basic fact work on the computer, which works on their basic facts for each one of those operations. We do that every single day. It charts it on my computer so I can go in and see where every kid's at. So that's something that we feel is important to make sure that our fact fluency is there. After that, we'll do a 2-minute math where it's in a 10-question assessment kind of what kids have already previously learned, but also of questions that maybe they haven't seen yet. And so it kind of gives me an idea of where I think we need to, in the future, way in the future, where we need to go to kind of hit and see where those, where they're not getting it. And so a lot of times you see that the geometry part is where kids just don't get it, but we know that we need to get there. So you start to see patterns and what kids don't get and don't get with that. But then as soon as that's over, then I'll go into my whole group talk. So we'll do that for 15 minutes or so, talk about what the strategy is, do a couple examples with that on the graph paper, and then from there, then we'll split into our small groups and we'll do our separate things.
So you rotate your small groups to you, right?
Yep.
So you have one, the others are working, one's with Ms. Ford, one's, and then you'll kind of rotate. Does her always stay with her?
Yes.
Through the whole time? So that group won't come back to you?
That group will come back to me at the very end. It'll be a little bit shorter than everybody else, but they will see me for a little bit of time just so I know that they've talked and had a conversation with me about the I can statement on the board.
Okay. So sounds good. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to listen to the conversations your kids are having and look for consistent language as well as strategies. So I'm going to kind of try to document some information there for you to share with you. And then I'm also going to listen to your questioning with your small groups to make sure that, to provide you feedback on how you're differentiating your questions for their specific needs. Does that sound fair?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is tomorrow at 9:40.
9:40, yes.
Is that right? 9:40?
Yes, so we get back from special and immediately we'll start it.
All right, well, I'll be down there and hiding in the corner of the room so that until such time I can move around so that I'm not too much of a distraction for you,
Yeah,
right?
fine, no problem.
All right, man, thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Nice clothes, by the way.
Yep, that's nice.
Twinning today.
I know.